All right. Without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Rebecca so she can start sharing our talk for the evening.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren, for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'll go ahead and get my slides going. There we go. So when Lauren first invited me to come and speak, I thought maybe this topic is a little too dry or not interesting to people. So it's really nice to see a good turnout. As Lauren said, I'm Rebecca Evanhoe. I'm a conversation designer. I have moved more into kind of content strategy, specifically in the realm of conversational tech. And I also teach conversation design. So I'm kind of always swimming in it. I know that our audience is pretty familiar with conversation design, but I just include this slide in all my talks. I think conversation design, people define it differently, so I like to start with how I define it. I view it as a form of user experience design for devices that talk and or listen. And for me, that umbrella includes both voice and chat, as well as multimodal stuff. So when I'm talking about conversation design and conversational tech, I'm thinking in this kind of encompassing way. I got started as a conversation designer, and as I was going along, I was having some problems related to content and how to organize the content and structure it, and came to realize that my problems were actually addressed by things like content strategy and information architecture. So I've never had those titles, but I'm sort of self-taught and always a student of these disciplines because they really inform, and like Lauren said, they feel very foundational to conversation design work. I also like to start, and I know I'm among friends here, but I like to give my definition of conversation. And then I like to point out how different conversation is from doing something like reading a web page. So the way that I work with conversation, I define it as a turn-based exchange of language between two parties. And that turn-based part is really significant. And I'll go through a couple slides to talk about why. So if we think through something we're all familiar with, which is using a search engine through a screen using a keyboard. This interaction is using language. So I'm typing in a query like, how much did it rain last night? And I'm getting results that are also in language. These are words and grammar structures that I recognize and I can read and skim through and kind of pick my answer. But it's not mimicking conversation, and I don't expect it to be a conversation. So my task here is to visually skim through these, click the one I want, maybe click around, but it's up to me to figure out when I feel satisfied that I've answered my question. So if we contrast that with actually using a conversational interaction, when we think about talking to something like a voice assistant, we use language and we know in our minds we are mimicking conversation. It really changes our expectations. So if I ask something like, Alexa, what's the weather? I'm expecting an answer, not a couple of possible answers or a few possible places I could look for the answer, but I want the answer itself. So I actually have pretty different conversations than when I'm using other tools to find information. And as a conversation designer, we're thinking about getting both of those pieces to work together across multiple turns. So we know that conversation can take place on tons of different devices, and I won't belabor it here because this group is very much in the know. But my point with this is, as I start to think about how I'm going to design the content or organize the information, I'm thinking about it potentially differently based on the device I'm using, whether it's voice or chat, whether things like a screen are involved, and I might make pretty radically different content design decisions based on the tech that I'm designing for. So I'm thinking through things like, how is content best served on this device? How is content best served in certain interfaces? How do people input content, and how is content best output, whether it is output through text or output through voice. So this idea of content strategy and conversation design, first I'll define content strategy, and then I'll just walk through some places where I see it surfacing when I am working as a designer, or whether I'm doing more high-level actual strategy work with a client. So some of you on this call may be content strategists, and you probably know that the term content strategy can be different for people use it differently. So I like the Christina Halverson definition, which is that content strategy is this big umbrella that encompasses 4 separate but related fields: content design, content marketing, content engineering, and content operations. So that's Christina Halverson's definition that I like. And my definition is that, like, when we're thinking through this content strategy lens, we're thinking specifically what we're trying to achieve with the content. We are thinking about the best way to design it, and we're thinking about how to organize and manage it. So to me, my approach to content is pretty expansive. But when I work with clients, they often ask me questions like these: what's the best way to design a chatbot? Which is better, voice or chat? Give us best practices for writing prompts. And while I could hypothetically give a few pointers for each of these, to me, I can't answer these questions until I know the content strategy. So content strategy is figuring out stuff like this. First of all, who is this content for? Why do they need this content? Why do they need this information? How are they getting the information today? What technology do they have access to? If we're building something for Alexa, we know that not everybody has one of these devices, for example. Content strategy also thinks deeply about the purpose. What are the business goals? What are the goals for the user? What does success look like? What are we trying to learn from the thing we're building, if the business has any of those like test and learn goals? And then when we know the audience and the purpose, only then can we start thinking about like fit, like what content do we have? What technologies are we working with? It only once you know audience and purpose, can you start figuring out something like, is voice or chat going to be better for this thing we're trying to accomplish? So very high level content strategy has to do with answering these questions. And I feel like a lot of us, myself included, have worked on an early stage project that was like, let's just make this thing because we can, and we have some stuff. We already have content that we can use to build it. And then getting into the process, you realize that like decision making is difficult if you aren't clear on these kind of high level factors. What are we trying to do? Content, if you are a content strategist or you work with content people, a lot of times people think about this term content as copy, or as like little pieces of copy or assets or articles or headlines, and conversation designers have, some of our content is copy, but there's actually a lot more in our content ecosystem. Content strategists sometimes do something called a content audit, where they identify all the pieces of stuff that could reach customers and then figure out how to accomplish that. When I think about a conversation designer's content ecosystem, I'm thinking, I like to think broadly, so I'm always thinking broadly. I'm thinking about the assets that I deliver, which are a primary list of all the prompts, like every single thing the bot could say, including error conditions, or like repair statements. I'm thinking of anything the bot might be pulling from a database or an API. Like, for example, if Alexa is pulling from Wikipedia, that's also part of our content ecosystem, just as an example. And in my purview, another aspect of the content that I have to work with is this idea of training data. If the system's using intents and utterances and slot values, that I would consider part of the content ecosystem. So I might not be the primary owner of that piece, but it certainly is part of the ecosystem that I'm working with and that I'm designing for. But we know, especially if we're doing voice stuff or multimodal stuff, that there are other content assets that we might also, I have been asked to produce all of these things or work with all of these things in my career. So we know that we're not just using text-to-speech voices or actor voice recordings. There could be ear cons and music and all kinds of things. We know if we're working with multimodal, you might have video that's part of the content ecosystem, or if there's an email or text aspect, you have content, you have copy and images potentially in those assets. If you're doing something that is meant to be in more than one language, now your content ecosystem has content in sort of two sets. I also think of things like stored user data, like, for example, again, if you have an Alexa device, it has account value or account information stored for you. And that potentially can also be part of our content ecosystem that would influence how we make decisions. And if you're working on something like a chat bot or something within an app, you might also be writing microcopy. So button names, or like what the little, like if your chat bot has little tappable buttons, all of this is part of the ecosystem. And I should say, a lot of the time, these things are owned by different people or even different teams. But as a conversation designer, I feel like I need to know the whole content ecosystem, even if I'm not the primary person owning it. I still need information to make decisions. I like to talk about content. I get asked this question a lot. People want to know how they can take their website content and put it into a voice, an Alexa skill, or put it into a chatbot. And they're like, this has got to be easy, right? We already have all this content. Some of you on this call have probably been involved in a project like this. To my view, this is never as easy as it seems, especially like people think about like website FAQs. They want to take those FAQs and turn them into an Alexa skill. And I will always say, like, yes, that is a great starting place. If we have well-written, well-organized content, we have a leg up in where we're starting. But we know that when we change the audience, the purpose, or the fit, it changes our content design decisions. So it's never a matter of just grabbing something and putting it over here. And I like to give some examples of why that's true. So there's a lot of information on this slide. I will walk you through it. What we're seeing here is an article from the CDC. Any organization that puts out news or press releases probably has a content management system with pretty well-stored, well-organized, well-tagged pieces. So an article will have all these pieces. It will have a date, it will have a headline, it will have a summary, and then it's got a body paragraph, and these are all divided up so that they can go into an RSS feed, so that they can go on the website. And a lot of people go, oh, cool, can't we turn our well-curated, organized press release or article content into voice experiences? And I've been asked how easy this is, and this is kind of my walkthrough of that. Yes, this is an awesome start to have this well-organized tagged content, and we can use it, but we need this plus a lot of other stuff. So we can see over here how that would go in a conversation, even if it was a pretty heavily templatized conversation. We have to account for what people say, like what they're going to ask for. And the example I'm giving here is what's the latest news on e-cigarettes. If we do like a voice version of how you might access this article, you can see that I did pull in the date. So that's a piece of information that we pull over. I did pull in the headline, But there's other kind of connective tissue that we have to account for, like the latest press release on that topic was published. That is something that's not present in the existing content. We have to create this new piece of content to introduce the date. We also have to add questions to keep the turn taking going. So it's like, yeah, this is such a great start, but it's never one-to-one. And in conversation design, we have extra pieces. And if your website, this is just my straight up personal opinion, if your website is confusing and the content's not good on there, I would fix your website first. I wouldn't make it a chatbot. That's something I could, let's chat about it over a beer, but I have opinions about that. So basically my takeaway here is, for orgs with existing content, you can totally do stuff with it, but there is extra stuff that's specific to the nature of conversation that we have to plan and go through the writing process, go through testing, and figure out our content management. How is it stored over time and updated? And our content operations, who produces it, what's the pipeline, who approves it, all of that stuff. And I also think that when people are coming from an org where they have a lot of content that's read, it's easier to see how that would turn into stuff a chatbot says. But the part that's missing is they forget about the training data. Like they forget, like, well, how many questions are people asking? Like, what's the breadth and what's the specificity of the questions? And like, what are keywords and what are variations? And that is a huge undertaking that for companies that haven't done conversational stuff, that's usually pretty underscoped. So takeaway of what I've talked about so far is that conversation design is a way of designing content, and the decisions that you make are always going to depend on how it's delivered. And I'll walk you through, let me see here, an example of how we have to write differently. If we're going from website content that's well written and approved by subject matter experts, and we're trying to move into conversation, we have to write differently. Like you would have different considerations. So the obvious example here is like on a website, we can have something like this list of bullet points. People can skim this. Here's a huge list of types of seafood. This is an appropriate list for a website because you can skim it. But if we're trying to move this into voice, it would be a really bad experience if a voice bot just started reading this off in bullet list format. That would not be what we would want to do for something we're listening to. So when we're trying to design a voice bot, we're thinking about more specific answers to more specific questions that people might have. And I'll dive into that a little bit later when I talk more about like information architecture. But there are special ways that we write for voice. And I would argue that a lot of these also apply to chat, but some of them are specific to voice. And I won't play the audio because I haven't tested it, but basically, like, for example, that giant list of more than a dozen seafood types, you really wouldn't want to read that whole list for a voice bot. So you would have to maybe figure out a couple of the key ones, or see if they want to follow up, or if they have a specific type of seafood they want to check on, or something like that. But the takeaway here is website content has to have a lot of extra stuff done to it to become voice content. And we also have to think about things like the tone of a website, like written tone versus a tone that we're hearing, especially if it's voice. And we might actually try to have the voice tone more casual or more novice, for example. So we might actually be targeting one tone on a website and a different tone in a voice or chat interaction. The other thing that I like to point out about this idea of tone, which is kind of a UX writing consideration, is that we can't just identify the target tone that we want, document it in our style guide and in our, writing wiki, and then move on. We also have to figure out how the tone that we're writing the bot's stuff in has an impact on what people say. People respond to the tone that they hear, especially in conversational mediums. So if we're writing with a very formal tone or a stiffer tone, that would potentially have most people ask their questions or type their questions more formally to match, or more in like phrases instead of complete sentences. But if your chatbot is taking on a tone that's very like friendly, or very natural sounding, then people are more likely to say or type their queries that way. More likely, not everybody's going to follow suit, but that would impact how they speak, how the training data would look. So let me take one quick peek in the chat. It looks like at least some people have had the experience of retrofitting all the content into a chatbot. Yes, that is a phrase that strikes fear into my heart. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to keep going with this thing of like content's different in different mediums. And now I'm going to get into this little thing that I think of as question and answer fit. And this is going to be kind of our gateway into information architecture. But this is basically another thing that when I'm working with content strategists and other folks who are newer to conversational tech, I have to explain this a lot. And I just think it's a really important point when we're thinking through that content ecosystem and all the content design decisions that we have to make. So we know, and if you've ever looked at transcripts or watched usability testing or just worked with a conversational product, you know that people ask a huge variation of questions based on what they want to know using their own words. So some people ask very broad questions. Tell me about a topic. Some people ask very specific questions. And then people use different vocabularies, different sets of jargon, different dialects. So we know that question variation is just like a huge area. When we look at the difference between reading a website and people actually asking questions, we know that people are potentially going to this website with different questions in mind. So the question, what grocery stores are affected? Is the fish at Sprouts okay? I bought haddock. Should I throw it out? Those are three very different questions. If I'm skimming a web page, no matter which question I have in mind, I'm doing that thing where I'm identifying my own answer. And so each of these people, each of these question askers will get their answer from this paragraph if they keep skimming, and that's fine. But when you try to put this into a conversation, the answer that people are expecting is a specific answer. And each of these questions would have a pretty radically different answer if you asked a human this question. So this is just another example of like, with web pages, people have their own question in mind and they kind of find their own answer in the content. But here in the conversational world, the specific question, people are expecting a specific piece of content, not a summary or a list. They want the answer, and it should feel like it fit their question. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like a real conversation. And this is just like a huge challenge that our field has in general. But this kind of bridges us into information architecture. I see information architecture kind of everywhere in conversation design. So like at its broadest, it's just deciding how to arrange information, whether it's language, whether it's data, whether it's a combination, trying to figure out how to arrange the parts so that these parts are like findable, understandable to a person. So it's like organizing, structuring, labeling information to be findable and usable. That's basically what we're doing when we are figuring out the intents of a bot and the scope of the intents of a bot. So like when we're designing intents, part of the challenge is that things might be understandable one way to people and another way to the algorithm that's parsing everything. And so when we design intents, we kind of have to satisfy both points of view. And it is a really interesting and complicated information architecture challenge. So this is just a summary of the inherent tension that we have when we're doing something like curating a set of intents with corresponding utterances and slots. If we make our intents very broad and put a bunch of similar, not quite exact questions, but similar questions, like we make these intents and just kind of stuff them full of pretty similar questions, then we also have to write slightly broader responses to cover all that. And I'll give an example of that in a second. When we do that, it can leave people feeling like the question doesn't fit. The answer doesn't fit their question. I'm just looking ahead real quick to what slide we're going to go on. Cool, I was just checking something. But if you make really specific intents, like intents that are like very specific forms of the question, then you end up with very specific, nice, narrow responses. Like, for example, these, if this is its own intent, and this is its own intent, and this is its own intent, I'm ending up with these specific responses that sound like very good answers to these specific questions. But then we all know what's going to happen is there's going to be way more of these intents. And when we start to get too many intents, especially if they're somewhat similar and using somewhat similar words, we can start creating problems for ourselves and reducing the accuracy. So this is, to me, always the inherent tension in conversation design. But I do feel like people often skew too broad. So yeah, this is just like a problem that I wrestle with in every single one. And it's very much a matter of information architecture. Like, where is that sweet spot between how we balance kind of our content? So another example of this is all these questions. Like, if we pretend we're building something for, we're building like a simple skill for something, a restaurant called Burrito Barn. And we know people are going to want to ask when what its hours are. All of these questions are sort of on that topic. A lot of them are pretty different potentially, but we all know that these are topically related to, like, when is this restaurant open? So if we put all these questions in the same intent, we would have to write a response like, Burrito Barn is open 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. every day. So that's fine, right? You might be like, cool, let's just go with this. But this response sounds natural for some of those, like, what are Burrito Barn's hours? Burrito Barn is open 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. every day. Okay, great, that fits. But for some of those questions, it doesn't feel like quite right. It doesn't feel fully conversational. So if we ask the question, does Burrito Barn close soon? If the bot answers, Burrito Barn is open 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. every day, I can extrapolate my answer, but it's making me do the work. Like, I asked a yes or no question. I'm expecting it to say, no, it closes in 3 hours, or yes, it closes in 15 minutes. I'm not expecting, I mean, this, you know, it's just not a good fit. A person would answer that question differently than this bot did. So when we, like, if I divided these questions up based on their semantic meaning and made them as specific as possible, let's pretend I make each of these its own intent. Well, now they're very specific. Now I've got these really nice, precise responses, but now I've got 5 intents instead of 1. And they all use similar terms. So the algorithm's not going to be able to handle that as well. And this is just a matter of like testing. I would just have to see how specific I could get. I would have to use testing and data to figure out which of these differences were the most meaningful to the audience, and run some testing and tuning trials to see what could actually work. I'm not going to talk about this slide just because it's kind of a repeat of stuff we've been talking about. But this intent specificity piece is something that I work through in every single project, and working with figuring out, in our case, which utterances are semantically similar and what the relationship of those utterances are to other utterances. That's very much an information architecture problem. If you have ever gotten a huge list of utterances pulled from transcripts and had to sort them by meaning into intents, that's basically an information architecture technique called like affinity mapping. So a lot of the work we do is already mirrored over there, and we have a lot of the same challenges. Let's see where we're at on time. I'll close with just a few highlights of the challenges that I see like across content strategy and information architecture and in our work. And I think like all of us who've worked with this tech know that like the root of our challenges is just like language is incredibly varied. So we know that within a language, even if we're all speaking the same dialect and we're all from the same region, we still can use different words to express our ideas. There's just variation in how we express ourselves. We know that within a language, there are different dialects, there are different accents, there are different vocabulary sets for different cultures within the same language and even within the same region. Language is tricky, and subtle changes in a sentence that could imply the sentence has an opposite meaning, or a subtle change in tone could imply the sentence has an opposite meaning. We're good at figuring that stuff out, and like machines aren't. So that's another thing that we're always trying to figure out. And then we know that languages evolve over time, and new words happen, and once common words become uncommon, and all kinds of stuff can happen. So this language variation introduces, oh, and another one I should add is that words mean different things to different people. Your contextual understanding of a word can be very different between two people, depending on your experience and all kinds of stuff. So this language piece just introduces challenges, whether you're working with language for a website, whether you're working with language, you're organizing menus in a website, you're setting up tags for a set of data, or whether you're working with conversation. Like this is just the root of our problems. Another challenge that ends up and kind of crops up in all those fields is the idea of cognitive load. All of these fields are concerned with how we can use accessible language so that we maximize the chances that the most number of people understand something clearly. We know that breaking information up into pieces, again, whether you're designing content for a website, whether you're designing content for a voice bot, you know that there are certain sizes of pieces that are important that we have to consider, and that would be different across different mediums. These two are actually just kind of specific to voice design, but they add to the cognitive load, like the fact that synthetic voices are higher cognitive load because they're not as good at reading and adding meaningful pauses and emphasis as people. That makes it harder for us to understand when we listen to it. So these are like extra challenges that conversation design folks have to account for, in addition to the classic ones. And conversation design has a lot of content problems, or like content challenges that you would see in other fields. Like, we know that context really informs what people are expecting, and figuring out that context is a huge part of the puzzle of content design. We know that classically across all these disciplines, a lot of people are involved with a lot of opinions. And we always have to figure out like the chain of command, who's signing off, who needs to give input. Again, over here, these are specific to conversation design, but we know that there's like extra content work when something's voice or even chat, like you would still be like editing for chat. And as a result, conversation design just requires a lot of iteration. In my experience, it just takes more cycles than writing content for like more visual mediums like websites. So these are some content challenges that I see. And then this is really just about conversation design. I think the one thing that I want people who maybe work on, they might be like content experts for websites and apps, when they go to work on conversational products, this is what I want them to know about our content ecosystem. All the parts, how we're doing the intents, how we're accounting for what people say, the bot's personality, the way that we're writing the bot's responses, and the way we're factoring in context, all of those parts are interconnected. So you can't change one without considering its impacts on the other. So for example, in this talk, I talked a lot about how we structure the intents impacts how we would write the prompt, how specific it is, how specific we can be with it. Do we need to be general? So if you change an intent, then you might have to look at writing new prompts, combining prompts, reconsidering how those are handled. We know that if we change the personality, that impacts how people say and what their expectations are. So we can't change the writing without considering the other pieces, like what are people going to say? For context, I mean, context is such a huge word in conversation design, and it means 100 things, but where people are at in physical space, what their mood is, what device they're using, what their prior experience with conversational technologies is, all of that plus 100 other things. What time of day is it? What's the culture of the person speaking? All of those would influence what they're expecting and what we would see. So we're really dealing with pretty complex co-created interactions. And it's sort of like language in and language out. So I think that this stuff is really exciting, but I also feel comforted by the fact that a lot of the problems that I've seen in my conversation design career have been addressed or at least commiserated with in these other fields of content strategy and information architecture. So those are some of my points of view. I think there's like a lot more that can be said. And so I'm really interested in hearing from all of you and your questions. And I know we have some good ones. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, Rebecca Evanhoe. I'm pretty easy to find. And you can check out, if you're really into conversation design, this book that I co-authored is available as well. So reach out to me if you want to chat further. And I will go ahead and stop sharing. And I know Lauren has curated a lot of questions, and there've been even more in the chat.
Yay! Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was such a fascinating talk. I loved how you encapsulated so many different aspects of the conversation design process, that like just those shorthands of like audience, purpose, fit for the content, super handy to remember. If those things are changing, you got to change your strategy and your approach. And all the different, for those of you here at the talk and those joining us in the future on the recording, I thought the list of all the different types of content was just like a great list to reference. And the tension between the broad and narrow, I want that screenshot to send to so many people.
And it's, the thing is, like, it's not going away. It's kind of an inherent thing. We know, I mean, we just come across it time and time again. And Yeah, I don't have a solution. I just know that it's always there.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the solution you have to find yourself, but that's not often the thing that stakeholders or team members want to hear.
Precisely.
Um, so, lots of great questions. We have a few in the chat I want to get to. One of the questions that I saw come in beforehand that I thought was, interesting was like how how are you documenting some of these content pieces? You mentioned creating or content pieces as well as the information architecture. You mentioned creating affinity diagrams, some of the content audits, but like what tools are you using to do some of that, or mixture of tools maybe?
I wish I had a cool answer. But I don't. I mean, I think Lauren's kind of working on a tool that is solving some of these issues that aren't solved, but like content management is really hard in conversation design. So we have to be really clear about how many documents are involved. So we know that there are documents that are thinking tools, that are discussion tools, that are information sharing tools, slide decks, infinity diagrams, brainstorms, drafts of flow diagrams, sample scripts. That's content that helps the design process. And those are like like I said, our thinking tools, our discussion tools. So that's one set of artifacts that's usually like on a wiki. Then you have your artifacts that actually represent what you intend to build. So those would be things like your flow diagrams, if you do product requirement documentation, if you work at Amazon, your PR FAQs, you have your set of documentation that's, we intend to build this. And that might include prompts lists, that might include the first draft of like a spreadsheet with your first draft of intents and utterances as your starter set. Then you have your documentation that is what is actually live in the product. So all the prompts, all the true training data that's being used. Often, but not always, people have flow diagrams that represent exactly what's in the product. And you might have other stuff like if it's pulling from an RSS feed or an API of some kind, there's also that living in that realm in some way. So most of it's in a wiki, and then the live version is usually in some kind of hallowed, agreed upon source of truth spaces. And all of these are usually across different tools. Like if you're using Lex or Dialogflow, your source of truth training data probably lives in that tool. Some teams have GitHub repositories where they check documents in and out. There is no, that I know of, there is no content management tool that, like, there's one called Gather, there's one called Jargon, there's a bunch of like content management tools, and none of them do exactly everything we need for a conversational product. So I think there's kind of a gap here, and usually these documents are only kept in a sensible space by the team caring about it. It's kind of like it has to be somebody's role, and usually like a product manager might help like wrangle everything. But that's my answer. I mean, Lauren, you live in this world too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're still scattered a lot across a lot of things. But for people who
Mhm.
aren't in this world, that means like you can use pen and paper to do some of this work. You can use whiteboards, post-its. I mean, obviously you have to get into the computer and get things in a spreadsheet, but that's where a lot of the stuff, for better or for worse, is still getting done, which, maybe lowers the barrier to entry in getting started, but still a lot of the concepts are foundational. A couple people were asking this in the chat, or one person at least. I know we had some come in from the attendees registering, but how about testing or assessing the content or information architecture using testing tools or research analysis tools, even analytics, how does that work into the content strategy, information architecture practice within conversation design?
Yeah, so this is such a good question. There are lots of ways to do testing. I have a science background, and so I'm always like, you have to figure out the question you're trying to answer and then design your experiment to answer the question. But like, there are different things that testing would target, right? So for example, you can do classic usability testing on an early stage bot. There are a bunch of different methods. The most common method of testing an early stage bot where no code is written yet is through Wizard of Oz method, where a person pretends to be the bot. And that can be done with a voice bot or a chatbot. So if you Google Wizard of Oz testing, you'll find a lot of really good articles about that. But that's a method that we have where we can actually usability test something before code is ever written, and that can actually help inform the code. There's also there's a bunch of different tools where you can build low or high level prototypes. I know Lauren and Matt are designing one right now. I've seen people do it in Figma, especially if it's a chat. You can make just an audio mock-up and play that for people and get their reaction. So there are ways of doing early stage prototyping. And then if you have, like, let's say you have a voice bot that's being built and it is far enough along that you can actually test the beta product, you can bring in testers. You can do it virtually, you can do it in person, bring in testers to interact with them and watch it the same as you would any other usability testing session. So that will give you a lot of information. But if you're talking about how do we check the accuracy, like let's look at the numbers, the analytics, how do we check the accuracy? How do we find utterances that should be in the training data that we don't have? You would potentially get some of that from usability, but you would also do a process of like tuning where you run different experiments on the training data itself and do things like regression testing. So there's some more like analytics based stuff that you can do as well. The tool that I know, there's a tool, I think it's called Dashbot, where you can track analytics for your bots. Lauren, do you know of other ones that you like?
Dashbot is, I think, still one of the only testing platforms. There have been a few others that have come in and out. And there might be ones that I'm not thinking of, but that's still one of the leading ones. And then I think the NLU providers and development tools are also building analytics into, like, Alexa might have some of that detail inside of the prompt, in, you know, where you're managing the intents and entities in the model itself. So those places are, and we have someone saying Dashbot is good. So yeah, and that and often can give you full chat transcript, so you can actually analyze some of the conversations playing out.
Yeah. So to sort of summarize the long stuff that I said, there's like usability testing, tons of methods for that. Then there's like your analytics, which is like, okay, what's our accuracy? How many utterances aren't working? Which intents is nobody getting to? Where are the drop-off points? Those come from dashboards, or like analytics dashboards like Dashbot and like in Alexa. And then Lauren, you also mentioned reviewing full transcripts, which is huge. And like, if you are looking at quantitative data, you should also be reviewing full transcripts because there's stuff going on in those transcripts that only a person can figure out. So numbers can tell you your problem hotspots, but the other qualitative methods kind of give the why and what to fix. Yeah.
Totally. I think those are great. Like, really pinpointing, mentioned in your talk how iterative this process is. This is like hammering that home, because yeah, we have to iterate to actually get something that ends up being usable and well-designed content. So I'm just searching through the chat. There were a lot of conversation going on. I have to say I co-sign your comment about fixing website copy before you start building a chatbot. Fixing information architecture on your website even before.
Totally. Like this is so many times, I'm just gonna get on the soapbox. This is what happens. I'll go to a client and they'll say, nobody likes the website because it's hard to use. Can you make a chatbot? And I go, where does the chatbot get the content? And they say, the website. And I'm like, how do you think this chatbot is? It just like makes me crazy. I'm like, are you listening to yourself? So anyway, clearly I've been asked to do this too many times and I'm just like,
yeah,
crazy.
it's helping establish the mental model that stakeholders, team members, clients need to have is part of the job. So yeah, sometimes it's a corrective aspect. So we had a question from Anam in the thread, and he's asking about that creation that you kind of talked about, thinking through all the different prompts, questions, and then all the different things users might ask towards your chatbot, your voice bot. Is it great to start from a narrow place, like let's figure out all the questions people are asking and then create the content, or from a more expansive place, here's all the questions we can answer, now let's backtrack and try to figure out what questions correspond to those answers?
Yep. So I would always say that being user-centered first is better. So I would say figure out all the things that people are asking first. And then you can assess like if you even have enough content for coverage. Like that helps you scope out how much content you need. So there's like kind of two ways to get that initial structure. The best one is use real data wherever you can get it. Do you have search queries from the website? Do you have actual transcripts from people either typing to a human rep or calling a human rep if it's a contact center solution? Use real things that customers are saying. And then a lot of times we'll end up with this huge set. We'll sort it. We'll do a little bit of kind of, usually it's sorted a little bit for us. If it's like a set of like 10,000 utterances, we might have some kind of machine learning thing to help us sort, and then a person would sort it in a more refined, accurate kind of way. So it's kind of assisted, but we use that to figure out very specifically what are everything everybody's asking. Then we have to make decisions later down the line about how actually what we need to answer, and like you make decisions from there. The other way, if you don't have any of that customer data, is kind of make your best guess and then test and iterate and add and add and add. So
smaller.
Yeah,
to writing responses for things that people aren't asking. It's no one likes doing work that doesn't get seen.
Totally. And I think people talk about like what I'm saying can sound like we have this idea we should crawl, walk, run. So doesn't sorting through 10,000 customer utterances sound like too much work in the beginning? And it's like, I'm not saying we build everything we find, but we need to understand the scope of what people want to talk about, because we're building something they're talking to, and then we prioritize from there. But I think the reason a lot of these projects are underscoped is because teams just deeply underestimate the breadth of topics and the specificity.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great closing thought to walk away with, is the likelihood that we might be all underestimating the work that goes into content strategy and information architecture in conversational AI, and that's why this is important to keep in mind. Thank you so much, Rebecca. This has been a fantastic talk. Screenshots were added to the thread, the one that I wanted. I downloaded it. Lots of great conversation and resources shared for people who were following along in the chat. And thanks so much. We loved having another great talk to round out our year. This is the penultimate conversational collective of the year. I believe we'll have one more talk. So everyone join us again in a month. And thanks so much, Rebecca.
Thank you. Great questions, everyone. Good night.
Good night.